Welcome back. Forget the introductions, no one cares about those anyway. It's the last episode of Oni, and I want to break things. And break them we shall, right after we finish our chores. Last episode, I laid plans for switching my food supply to a more sustainable animal cruelty model, featuring the humble regolith eating shovel as the guest of honor. This plan has a notable flaw that didn't quite register to me at the time, which is the regolith itself. Regolith is meteoric dust, which means it comes from space. And space, as we all know, is a balmy 300 degrees centigrade. Amazingly, my colony's internal heat management infrastructure is capable of deleting almost all of the heat being introduced with the regolith transfer, but the keyword there is almost, and the polluted water I'm using as coolant is slowly and steadily losing the fight. Instead of scrambling to upgrade the colony cooling for what is ultimately a transient issue, what I can do instead is temporarily run the regolith through some metal tiles in the pipe conditioning part of my liquid gas cooler. Conveyor rails carry 20 kilos of material per tile per second, and the heat from 20 kilos per second of regolith is pretty substantial, but as long as I don't need to condition my pipes and do fuel transfer to the rocket, we can have that system working on regolith instead. The project also dovetails nicely with some long-anticipated upgrades to the rocket system itself, which require me to redo the pipe chiller design anyway, so I can kind of double dip there. All of that construction work produces this lovely shaft of extremely explosive gas wrapped in a nice steel package. Cassie's job is to pilot this explosive death trap all the way out to 130,000 kilometers, where she can then scan and mine a bunch of materials from a gilded asteroid, which should, in theory, net me somewhere in the neighborhood of 720 kilograms of fullerene and satisfy any coolant demands I have for the rest of the game. The only drawback is the round-trip time. Bye-bye, Cassie. See you in like a month or something. Okay, actually no, it only ends up being 380 kilos because I forgot I only went with one storage module, but the point remains, it's a lot of fullerene. And speaking of lots of things, shovels. Now that my initial breeding stock has produced a few eggs, I can start making use of something referred to by the Oni community as starvation farming. I can't quite remember if I already explained how it works, but just in case I didn't, the basic idea is that critters are born with a full belly, and certain critters have enough food in their belly and a short enough life cycle that if you buff their reproduction rates by grooming them and keeping them happy, they will produce an egg before they starve. The wiki helpfully lists the exact numbers behind this if you're interested, but they boil down to me needing 2 shovels for every dupe to sustain my colony off of barbecue alone, though by sheer coincidence, this actually brings up an interesting meta point that I want to touch on, which is the wiki itself. So to preface all of this, overall, I am a huge fan of well-written, well-supported wikis for games, especially ones like Oni, where there's a lot of complicated mechanics that would be a major pain in the butt to experiment with. Case in point, figuring out how much power a solar panel makes on average would require either calculus, which I haven't needed to use in 6 years, or a long, drawn-out experiment that I would much rather skip. Well, thanks to the wiki, I and anyone with an internet connection can have the answer to that question in about 10 seconds. Cool. One math nerd gets a bit of kudos, and everyone else gets free information to push the horizon of cool builds forward a notch without any of the annoying slog that usually goes into the progressive tech development to do so. My problem, and mind you that this is very much a me problem here, is that the Oni wiki is so good that it kind of spoils the game. So for example, earlier on in the run I wanted to read up on morbs. The in-game entry for them is maybe a paragraph long and is 80% lore, and I'm not exaggerating. The only useful things it says about morbs is a vague description of them being attracted to unhygienic conditions, which who knows what that means, that they produce polluted oxygen, and it also lists their temperature tolerance profiles. None of that information is useful, and very little of it is particularly actionable, so I looked them up on the wiki, and the wiki has a ton of information on them. It tells you what conditions spawn them, what their production rates are like, how their AI works, all that good stuff. But it also tells you the most optimal way to farm them, how to maximize their output, and how to mitigate or remove the downsides that come from using them. Now, I might be reading into this a little too much, but in my mind there is a distinct categorical difference between those two sets of information. The first set is stuff like what a morb is and what it does, which is stuff that's usually given to you for free by the game or is easy enough to discover, but would be annoying to have to remember or calculate when you needed it in the moment. I see this as like the Oni equivalent of the Minecraft property encyclopedia. It is a reference guide for people who don't want to have to search the breadth of the game every time they need an obscure piece of information. And that's it. It doesn't tell you how to solve the problem, and it certainly doesn't tell you how to do anything. It just tells you how to use the tools in your toolbox. Which brings us to the second category of information, which is where the wiki tries to tell you how to play the game. And there is a lot of that second category in the Oni wiki, and it is absolutely unavoidable. It feels like I can go in and ask the wiki, hey, I want to know things about morbs. And instead of telling me things about morbs, the wiki will turn around and say, yeah, sure, here's some cool things about morbs. They spawn on outhouses with this really quirky mechanic that we're not going to explain because this design here is the best way of exploiting it. This is the optimal solution. Don't experiment with it. Don't try new things. Just do this and never think about it again, and you will be happier. And to the wiki's credit, it's usually correct, or at least correct enough that I can't discern any noticeable difference between my implementation and the wiki's implementation. But that's not how I want to play the game. So again, the same situation. I wanted to look up information about where electrolyzers output their gas. Well, the wiki says, on the 4 blocks the electrolyzers occupy, blah, 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 blah. Oh, by the way, did you know that electrolyzers can be used as a really efficient way of deleting heat? Here's how to do that. That's what you wanted when you came here, right? Because this is way better than any other way in the game, so you should use it. And it just keeps going on. And it does this for, like, every entry on the site. To be clear, I don't think this makes the wiki bad, per se, but I definitely think that reading the wiki, and by extension being better at the game, has made the game less fun for me to play. The in-game guide is riddled with these weird gaps where it feels like the devs just couldn't be bothered to add entries for stuff, so I ended up using the wiki a lot just to fill in those holes, and inevitably, every time I looked something up, I ended falling down a rabbit hole of hyper-optimized builds or techniques or what have you, involving the thing or exploits you could use the thing for, when all I wanted to know was where in the world the thing spawned, so I could get some and mess around with it. And I get it, it's an older game that's had a lot of time to develop a technically experienced community of people who play it at a very high level, and they want to show off all the cool stuff they designed to their fellow game veterans. I'm not one of those people, and would have kind of appreciated a chance to be dumb and design my own stuff without knowing the best way of doing things, because if I know the best way of doing things, I'm forced to choose between copying all my stuff off of someone else's wiki page, or playing as myself with a constant reminder that everything I do has already been done better 10 years ago. So anyway, this has been your Goose Soapbox Moment of the Week. Let's move on. Operation Basement Bash has been a screaming success, considering the hardware I had available with me to throw it, but even with the steam removed and the biome cooled to a nice, non-flesh evaporating temperature of technically not boiling, I still have to finish flushing the heat and ripping out all of the nasty gases that have been falling down and accumulating for the past 1,000 cycles or so. Heat removal is going to be a breeze to pull off now that I have large supplies of I can't believe it's not Windex, and oxygen would be easy with some upgraded electrolyzers, but I don't want easy or optimal or wiki approved. I want memes. So it's time for some research. The wiki has information about how morb oxygen production works and lists the basic requirements. The morb can't be in a vacuum, it can't be waterlogged or in any kind of liquid. There has to be less than 1 kilo of gas pressure in the tile the morb is in when it tries to poop out the gas, etc. It also mentions a movement requirement, where morbs trapped in a 1-block hole don't produce anything, and I checked, this is a movement requirement, not a room size requirement. So begs the question, does more movement equal more production? Testing this turned out to be tricky. I initially made a bunch of different sized boxes and dumped a bit of carbon dioxide in them to start them off and let them run, but the test was terrible because the smaller boxes overpressurized before I could get good sample sizes, and making the boxes taller just delayed the problem. So I threw that one out, and I tried a second test using boxes with a bunch of different non-polluted oxygen gases at low concentrations to try and overpressurize the polluted oxygen, and that didn't work either because the morbs deleted the other gases and threw my results off that way. but it was good enough to convince me that more space improves production rates. So eventually I got fed up with the whole thing and just made multiple oxygen production setups of various sizes to test over a long period of time. These work thanks to an interesting quirk of how deodorizers and gas flow works. Deodorizers have a 2-block wide range that they can pick up polluted oxygen in, but normally they can't pick it up through walls because that would be dumb. But what they can do is pick up gases through tiles that naturally allow gas flow, so mesh tiles, airflow tiles, pneumatic doors, etc. And they can also pick it up through blobs of liquid for some reason. So this turns mesh tiles with liquids in them into membranes that the deodorizer can see through, but gases can't flow through, allowing you to separate out polluted oxygen from the morbs and clean oxygen from the deodorizers. The test environment with the system is the same, but instead of using random gases to overpressure the polluted oxygen, we just use deodorizers to clip the gas through the membrane and measure how much clean oxygen comes out the other end. And other than one annoying misclick that deleted the results from my 2-block wide test, this works perfectly, and it shows a clear log-ish pattern of growth that seems to top out around 7 blocks wide or so, which annoyingly enough matches the wiki word for word. Man, I hate it when competent people snipe all the cool low-hanging fruit and publish the results before I can. So the design is theory crafted. The real trick is going to be getting the morbs downstairs. I can keep morbs from producing gas by exploiting their 1-tile movement space limitation and cramming a bunch of them into 1x4 rooms with nothing but a critter delivery marker, which will also have the convenient side benefit of telling me how many I have down there. But that isn't the problem. The problem is that I may or may not have forgotten to turn off the morb collection unit and just sort of left it running for, ever. Because there were random blobs of gas floating around inside of the morb collection unit, the polluted oxygen levels have also been overpressurizing for an equitable amount of time, and while in some spots it only goes up to a nice moderate 48 kilograms per square tile, certain rooms are sitting at 3,400, which is really not gonna make people happy. So, before we start morbing, let's make one minor modification to the plan. Space, in addition to being the final frontier, is an excellent garbage disposal. Because my morb boxes conveniently are positioned next to the eternal trash bin in the sky, I can block off most of the morb box from the rest of my base, slam a quick water lock in place for the rest of it, and then crack a hole in the roof to harmlessly make all of that nasty polluted morb gas into someone else's problem. With that fixed, I get started, and very quickly realize that the Great Morb Migration is without a doubt going to be the singularly most annoying and agonizingly slow process I have ever experienced in this game to date. Morbs can't be wrangled, they can only be caught in traps, which require a skilled duplicate to arm and extract them from. Once the morbs are trapped, they can be hauled and delivered by anyone, but the distance a dupe has to travel with a bag morb is so long that inevitably they end up wanting to go and take a nap, or eat, or something stupid like that, and then drop the morb in the middle of the base, which will then free the morb, requiring me to assemble another trap in the base itself to recapture the morb and let it resume its journey. To make matters even worse, dupes also don't seem to like to take more than one morb at a time unless the traps containing morbs are literally right next to each other, and I have so many morbs. I eventually ended up just making a huge morb jungle gym to expose them to more traps in hopes that that would convince dupes to take multiple morbs more often, and skilled everyone in my colony up enough to let them rearm and handle the morbs, but it still was not enough. So eventually, with 11 cages of 40 morbs each and no end in sight, I decided the most efficient thing I could do would be to send the rest of the morbs on a one-way trip to the Great Polluted Oxygen Sink in the sky via laser. Because otherwise, I might end up needing an entire row of deodorizers to purify all the oxygen. Murdering the morb ball also had the unintended side effect of recovering a shockingly large amount of my frame rate, which is odd, because morbs really don't do much of anything. From this, I can only conclude that Oni was running their pathing calculations every time any morb moved in real time, which, my dudes, say it with me, path caching. Yeesh. Ironically, even after slugging through 440 morbs worth of this lag-infused boredom, I don't even end up using most of the ones I brought down. I did the math, and if I were to use all 440, I would have ended up creating a system capable of producing 12.5 kilograms of oxygen a second. That spammed around a third of the buildable map space, at which point it would have started substantially impacting airflow. I opted instead to scale it back to a mere 240 morbs, which still produces a pointlessly excessive 6.8 kilograms of oxygen, but results in a design that is small enough that I can at least see all of it at one time, and it will hopefully not lag my game too much. The filtration setup on top of the polluted oxygen sink basically builds itself. I have a system to pull clay out and dump it on the ground, and a system to let me feed in sand or regolith to use as a filtration medium, sitting on top of enough deodorizers to make a frat house smell like a rose garden, which are themselves sitting on a oil-flooded mesh tile system, keeping the gases separate. The whole thing is sealed, and if I ever need to vent gas, I can do that using the airlock doors installed in the roof. I also finally came to my senses and have started using the debug option that lets me overclock the game's tick speed as fast as possible. I have no idea why I wasn't using this at this point. It just would have saved me literal hours of waiting. But regardless, using that lets me get these big projects done faster, so setting up this whole thing didn't even take that long in real time, but my dupes would probably disagree with that. Of course, all good things can never go to plan. You might look at this and go, oh no, Goose had another core breach. And while you wouldn't technically be wrong, it isn't quite that simple. As near as I can tell, when I was cleaning out space for the morb box, I accidentally exposed a couple pieces of hot abyssalite. On its own, this is not a big deal, because the heat transfer from abyssalite is not that substantial, but when abyssalite comes in contact with fluids, the effective rate of heat transfer skyrockets, because the thermal density of, say, water, is substantially higher than gas, resulting in these huge plumes of sour gas and steam that I now have to chill down again. I have the abyssalite capped off for now, but this does give me an interesting idea, and having nothing more productive to do with my time, I decide to chase it full hog. One of the many useful properties of doors in this game is how they transfer heat, or more specifically, how they don't. When a door is opened and in a vacuum, as far as I can tell, there is no way for it to exchange heat with its surroundings, with the possible exception of conduction panels, which are explicitly designed to function in that situation. So this begs some interesting questions, and I suspect the answer to those questions is going to be what I need for one of the final projects of this series, a complete elimination of my magma heatsink. And yeah. Spoilers, this does not work, but not for the reasons that you're thinking. Thanks to my adventures in space, I have access to an endgame metal alloy called thermium, a material with some very interesting thermal properties. In addition to applying a passive overheat temperature buff of 900 degrees centigrade to any machine made out of it, it has the ability to transfer heat very, very efficiently. To put it in perspective, radiant lead pipes, which I'm using for basically everything to do with cooling, have a transfer rate of 70. Pipes and conductive materials made out of thermium have a transfer rate of 440. It's obscene, and would be perfect for wicking away all the heat in my magma sump if it weren't for one slight issue. And that issue is thermium is way too strong for me to safely be using. The hottest parts of my heat sump are around 660 degrees Celsius, and if I had built some way of conducting heat through the abyssalite using thermium, I would very quickly equalize all of the heat from under the map, which is less than desirable for reasons that should be really obvious. So that's where the doors come in. By building a small room full of doors, I can effectively toggle whether or not I want my systems to extract heat from the steam bomb by opening or closing the doors. When open, they are in a perfect vacuum and are unable to transfer heat from all the bridges and whatnot that I can build across the abyssalite. When they're closed, the bridges are all touching both the hot steam and the cold doors, and can then dump their heat into some metal tiles, which I will build above them. The heat goes in the water, which boils to steam, which then gets diluted by my turbines to produce power. Easy peasy. That was the plan, until one of my dupes popped a hole in the abyssalite layer, requiring an emergency response to patch the access point so that my entire map does not blow up, and kind of ruining that idea. So, change of plans, we're doing a bog standard heat deletion setup with a whole buttload of active cooling because those turbines are not going to be happy with me. Of course, if I'm going to be cleaning up all the steam, that means I'm going to be removing my primary source of power production. This does not concern me, because very shortly I will be flying all of my dupes into the temporal tear and energy production will be a moot point, but in the interest of at least pretending that anything I do in this episode has any purpose other than me messing around with the game, let's engineer our way out of it anyway. The obvious big-ticket energy production method I have at my disposal is sour gas refinement. 1 kilogram of water in an oil well produces 3.3 kilos of oil, which can be heated above 540 degrees centigrade to produce 3.3 kilos of sour gas. Cooling the gas below negative 161 degrees makes 2.2 kilos of liquid methane and waste sulfur, and the methane can then be reheated to make 2.2 kilos of natural gas, which is enough gas per second to power 24 natural gas generators, producing in total 19,200 watts of power and 1.65 kilos of polluted water, which will quickly boil in the ambient heat produced by the generators and be extracted with a steam turbine, making the whole loop net positive. You got all that? Cool. Great. That all works in theory, now we have to implement it. The first part of this mess is building the oil well. It accepts a piped-in supply of water and drips oil on the ground, and every once in a while we'll need a duplicant to release a buildup of hot natural gas. The piped-in water supply means that I'd like the system to stay below 100 degrees centigrade to avoid having my water flash into steam, but beyond that it's not terribly picky. Oil wells don't flood, so I can use the oil that the machine produces to create a liquid lock that allows easy duplicant access and will limit sour gas backflow, and the natural gas it produces can be pulled off with a thermium pump and injected into a natural gas generator once I build them. The only new thing I do here is build a tube of mesh tile made out of pyrite, which has a very low thermal conductivity, and will hopefully reduce the amount of heat that can work its way back into the oil well from the rest of the system. I may need to actively cool this, but we'll see. The second part is the boiler. My plan is to have the oil from the well drip onto a thermium aquatuner surrounded by temp shift plates at the bottom of a shaft, with airflow tiles allowing gas to escape on the left. This is a hotbox where the oil will flash into sour gas. Hopefully. When it does, if it does, it will fly up and get shoved through the airflow tiles in a cooling chamber with another pit, this one filled with radiant pipes and temp shift plates. That will be the cold side of my aquatuner's fluid loop, which will chill the gas down into methane and sulfur. The goal here is to get a constant stream of hot sour gas flowing into the condenser, which will hopefully combine with Oni's nearly fanatical predisposition to force cold gas packets down in homogeneous gas bodies to create a cold trap that will minimize energy losses due to the aquatuner cooling itself. To safely transport the methane without pipe breakage, I plan on running a separate insulated shaft cooled by natural gas that it evaporates into. Gas pumping is fairly uninteresting, other than needing 5 of the things. I make sure to drip the cold methane on a spot I know I can pull heat from safely, plumb it up, and move on with my life. And now for the obnoxious part. I need to pull a perfect vacuum on a room large enough to support 24 natural gas generators, and then I need to supply the steel needed to make 24 natural gas generators. One of these is substantially easier than the other. The vacuum part can be solved by spam constructing large amounts of tiles and accessing the area from my still currently sealed vacuum in the sour gas boiler. The steel part requires the bulk excavation of yet more priceless archaeological sites, which basically does nothing other than waste my time. Go-Go Gadget debug mode. Having successfully utilized the power of being a filthy cheater, my extremely large box of steel and pain finishes up in a mere 2 or so hours, leaving me with like a 90% complete hypothetically functional sour gas boiler. I still need carbon dioxide skimmers and steam turbines and water filters and stuff, but if the boiler part doesn't work, there honestly is not much point in having those, so we'll put those off for now. The first step after making sure everything is sealed up is to pre-chill the methane pipes, and the natural gas chilling part is the bit that I expect to break the most, honestly, but if need be I can break into that bit and tinker with it later, so I'm not too concerned about something going haywire. At the last minute, I also decide to slam in a way for me to feed in excess gas. As I see it, there is no reason not to pump in sour gas that I have stored up if it actually does work, so why not? And with everything as ready as it can be, it's time for a full speed ahead on the refinement process. And it doesn't work. Well, okay, it sort of works, but I put the aqua tuner in backwards, so the methane keeps condensing too high up in the shaft and turning back into natural gas. And also the aqua tuner isn't producing enough heat to keep up with oil production, so it isn't really all that effective. Honestly, even when I have the aqua tuner in the right way around, it does not improve a whole lot. I managed to get a few drops of natural gas out by condensing what little I made, but now the system is so cold, the methane keeps freezing instead of liquefying, and my aqua tuner system is still too cold to boil more sour gas. To try and combat this, I disabled oil production and have my dupes run the coolant through a liquid tapidizer bath just to try and inject more heat into the system. Theoretically, this thing should be very heat positive since I'm burning cold natural gas created with hot oil, but maybe I just need to saturate it a little bit more. On the next heating cycle, the sour gas flashes like normal, which is good, but in doing so, it supersaturates my coolant loops with heat, which is bad, and forces the gas to remain in its sour form and indirectly transfer the heat right back into the aqua tuner, which is obviously not what we want to be happening. I sort of solved this by rearranging the pipe runs so the coolant has less space to travel through and picks up less heat from the system, and by re-enabling oil production to try and sink some of the heat into a fluid instead of a gas. This helps, but it remains to be seen whether I will get any methane out of it. And to my complete amazement, I do. It isn't, like, enormous amounts, and I will definitely need to replace the metal tiles above my oil feeder with something more insulating because the cold natural gas nearly froze the oil over, but the system does, by the barest margins, count as functional. After letting it run for a bit, I can confidently say that the biggest issue with the design is the enormous buttload of natural gas making its way into the boiling chamber instead of being pumped out, and the overall inefficiency with which it transfers heat, just like across the board, makes it basically unusable. I could waste a massive amount of time tearing the thing apart and redesigning it, but let's be real here, the episode is almost over. I still want to take a crack at destroying all the steam in the magma layer, and this thing is never going to be producing power for me anyway, because I'm going to be gone in another 100 cycles. I messed around with it a bit in debug mode to see if I could slap on some automated door nonsense to help transfer the natural gas, and was pretty pleased with the results, and then entirely forgot about it after that. There is a world in which I revisit the idea at a later date, but honestly, why bother? There are better designs out there that people can copy if you're interested in building one. You don't need to sit through 5 hours of me mumbling about how I can't quite get my hack together nonsense to work. So then, Steam deletion. No. After doing some real quick back-of-the-napkin math, which I'm famously good at and have never made any mistakes with at all, I can quite confidently say that I never had a sliver of a chance of getting rid of all of the steam before my final rocket launch. Sorry to disappoint, but the numbers are about as clear as a no-thank-you themed Hallmark card 5 stories tall with a giant middle finger embossed in neon pink Laffy Taffy. A really rough underestimate tells me I have 2,800 steam tiles under the map, each containing 700-ish kilograms of steam at 400-ish degrees Celsius. Steam has a specific heat capacity of 4.19 plus a bunch of units that we aren't going to talk about, and when you multiply all those numbers together, you get 2.73 billion DTU that I'd have to remove before the water condensed, before taking into account the massive amount of heat still stored in the rock down with the steam, which is probably another 1 billion DTU alone. Steam turbines delete heat less efficiently at lower temperatures, but assuming I was able to feed them 400 degrees centigrade steam non-stop, 10 steam turbines would require somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 cycles to drain the steam patch. Incidentally, this means I did not need to worry about running out of power, because even by my most extravagant estimates, the steam blob would have been able to keep my colony going for another 600 cycles, and that number would probably have tripled or quadrupled if I'd ever bothered using solar. I don't know about you, but I don't particularly want to watch me play the game for another 30 hours to clean up a mess in a world that won't exist in a few minutes, so I instead direct my dupes towards their final task of building a rocket to take them all out of this horrible hellscape. This thing is gonna be a monster. In order to reach that far out into the system, it will need 4 fuel tanks, 2 oxidizer tanks, and also be carrying 8 sightseeing modules and a command capsule for all of my dupes. And each of those sightseeing modules will need a gantry to allow the duplicants to access them. Cassio is out with a rocket right now doing some last-minute research to unlock the sightseeing modules, so I can't tinker with the rocket itself yet, but I will need to expand my pipe chiller to account for the increased fuel and coolant module count, and I can get the gantries going while she's away, so I get started early. Once Cassio is finished with her stroll around the celestial neighborhood, I redirect my attention back to the rocket itself. By sheer coincidence, and I do mean that, I did not plan for this, the rocket's launch tube is exactly tall enough to fit the rocket that I need to build. If you remove the blast doors. Some days you live right, and some days you have to shave a little off the top to make ends meet. I can't have nice things, so I have to deal with one last inconvenience before I can get the rocket off the ground, which is the lack of spare Atmos suits. This is not really an issue because I can have the people who didn't dibs the first suits clean out the other docks and haul them up to the space docks, but, you know, in case you haven't been paying attention to this episode and still think that everything I do is well planned and perfectly executed, here is your reminder that I am mostly making it up as I go along. Anyway, once I get the suits where they need to be, my dupes board the ship, and my game crashes. Great. Well, while we're trying that again, here's some final thoughts for you. First off, overall I really enjoyed Oxygen Not Included. In particular, I liked something that I spent exactly 0 time talking about, which was its art style. Unlike most colony sims, Oxygen Not Included puts a lot of work into looking good. Every interaction in the game seems to have been animated with the express purpose of giving your dupes a personality, and all of that is expressed with these goofy little animations and quirky sound effects that make your colony feel alive in a way that you really don't see in games like this very often. Mechanically speaking, the game was solid. There was definitely some quirks that felt a little bit unnatural, looking at you, infinite storage tanks. But overall, the physics engine was consistent enough for me to work with and stable enough to not make my computer explode into a pile of goo, and the corners that Cly cut when designing it didn't detract from the experience, which puts it head and shoulders above basically any AAA game that's come out in the past 5 years, so I will take it. Now we get to the downsides. With hindsight being 2020, I can look back and say that my colony had some serious first playthrough energy. The later episodes were a massive time sink to record, not because what I was doing was really all that complicated, but because there was just so much of it to do, and it was all so far away from my center of operation, and I had so few dupes to do it with that I had to leave the game running for hours to get anything done. The first and second parts of this aren't entirely within my control, but there was no reason for me to not address the last one. This isn't like RimWorld, where 90% of the pawns you can recruit in the endgame are actively worth less than the gear that they're wearing. Dupes in Oni are almost always beneficial, and their upkeep is minimal, and I should have been taking advantage of that the instant I had excess food and oxygen. On that same token, a lot of the stuff that I did do ended up being either entirely worthless or so excessively over-engineered that a solution a quarter of the size would have been enough. So I look at all of this and mostly just see an experience, but there did seem to be a serious trend towards bogging down in the mid to late game as your easy resource options start drying up. There's a valid argument to be considered here that says that this is just good game design and that you want more challenging gameplay to be compressed towards the end of the game where people have had a chance to learn all the mechanics and get familiar with the controls. But when I was playing the game, most of my experience was that it just seemed like the game slowed down a lot in the endgame, and I can't say that that really sat well with me. But regardless, this has been Oxygen Not Included. Noeda and 7 Days are still on the table, though I don't quite know how or when they will be served, as I have a couple of other series ideas that I really want to get off the ground first. So for now, I will simply say thank you for your time, and that I hope you enjoyed.